The moment I stepped toward the exit, everything paused, like the air itself had thickened. The nurse's hand hovered over the discharge papers, fingers tense, uncertain. My mother's signature glared at me from the form, sharp and final, but the doctor's gaze lingered on the document with a quiet, unsettling intensity. His pen froze midair above the clipboard. There was a pause that seemed to stretch seconds into minutes, and in that silence, I felt an awareness sharpen inside me. I already knew something was off. The receptionist's hand twitched toward the phone, only to recoil immediately as if sensing an invisible fault line beneath the usual protocol. I noticed it, cataloged it. The orderly by the door shifted, eyes flicking from the form to the doctor, lingering a second too long. Monitors near the nurse's station beeped at irregular intervals, their rhythms slightly off, almost like they were echoing the tension in the room. The hospital had a familiar hum, but now it sounded disjointed, each minor sound amplified in the thickened air around me. My mother pushed the clipboard toward the doctor, her calm confidence radiating like a shield. "Everything's in order," she said smoothly, glancing at me only briefly. The doctor exhaled slowly, jaw tightening imperceptibly. His fingers paused over the keyboard, hesitating to enter the electronic records, eyes darting to a timestamp mismatch in the system, a tiny discrepancy that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. I saw it instantly. This wasn't just a procedural hiccup, it was a seed of control slipping in my favor, though no one yet realized it. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Observation was my language. The nurse's lips pressed together as she leaned over the counter, subtle tension in her shoulders. A pen rolled quietly off the workstation, clinking against the tile, drawing a glance from the doctor that lasted just long enough to catch my attention. Small things, almost inconsequential, yet each detail added to the imbalance of authority: an overconfident mother, a hesitant doctor, a staff uncertain of their own steps. Even in her confidence, my mother's fingers lingered a fraction too long on the form. Her posture suggested control, but I noticed a twitch in her wrist, a micro-hesitation she likely believed unnoticed. The doctor's eyes flicked toward the form version number, then back to me, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. This discharge wasn't as settled as everyone assumed. The first 30 seconds set the stage, minor, almost invisible cracks revealing a hidden fault line in her victory. I cataloged every subtle cue, the slight tremor of the nurse's hand as she adjusted a stack of charts, the flicker of hesitation in the orderly's gaze, the half-raised eyebrow of the receptionist as she glanced at the pending digital approvals. Each action, each hesitation was a thread I could trace. Every small error in procedure, mismatched timestamp, duplicate form line, electronic record lag, whispered of an opportunity to reclaim the narrative silently, methodically. My pulse quickened, not in fear, but in sharpened alertness. A minor misalignment in the electronic record caught my eye, the kind of detail that staff rarely noticed in routine processes. I observed it and stored it, knowing this single small anomaly could become a hinge for the unfolding reversal. I could feel the subtle tension in the air, a quiet storm forming around ordinary hospital motions. The doctor finally spoke, his voice calm but deliberate. "Wait, the timestamp here doesn't align with the discharge record," he said softly, eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second. My mother's smile faltered imperceptibly. She shifted her weight, the signature now appearing less like a declaration and more like a challenge to reality. Around us, staff members adjusted their movements, minute reactions betraying an awareness they could not voice. I leaned slightly back, taking in the room, the lobby, the chairs, the humming monitors, the distant announcements, all ordinary elements now carrying a tension that only heightened my clarity. Every movement, every pause, every micro-expression became data. Each small hesitation was a step closer to the truth. I felt the power in quiet observation, in patience, in noticing what others missed. My mother, still unaware of the subtle unraveling, tapped the form again. "It's all done," she said, confident, almost triumphant. But the doctor's eyes, steady and unyielding, lingered on the anomaly, his fingers poised but not typing. I watched as the misalignment of the form, the duplicate signature line, and the timestamp discrepancy layered together, each minor flaw, invisible to everyone else, glaring to me, a silent warning and a promise all at once. I cataloged it all, silently noting the imbalance of authority, staff gestures, the uneven rhythm of machines, the twitch of a hand, the subtle frown of the doctor, all hinted at what my mother could not see. Her control was assumed, but the narrative was quietly shifting. I wasn't trapped, not truly. Observation was preparation, and preparation was power. A tiny breath escaped my lips, just enough for me to notice it. It was not panic. It was awareness, a small tightening of my hands against my thighs, a barely perceptible shift in posture marked the difference between passive presence and active recognition. I knew the discharge might appear final, but every tiny misstep, every procedural anomaly, every flicker of hesitation planted the groundwork for the correction to come. And so, I waited, calm, observant, cataloging every micro-action, every procedural irregularity. The lobby's energy buzzed with uncertainty no one else could name, but I felt it in sharp, undeniable clarity. The storm was quiet, but it had begun. The authority, the system, even my mother's confident stride, all poised on the edge of an inevitable shift. In that suspended moment, I understood something vital. What seemed like my powerlessness was only perception. Each micro-error, each hesitation, each procedural detail was a doorway, and I was already planning to step through it. The moment my mother walked away with the clipboard, the quiet tension I had sensed in the lobby seemed to thicken even further. No one spoke. The hum of machines and the faint squeak of wheels against the polished floors felt like the only sounds that mattered. My mother's assertiveness remained unshaken, but the doctor's gaze, sharp and calculating, didn't leave the form even for a second. I knew, even then, that what appeared to be routine procedures was anything but ordinary. I was gently guided back to my room by the nurse, who kept glancing over her shoulder with a hesitant smile that didn't reach her eyes. The orderly, who had seemed so indifferent in the lobby, now lingered near the doorway, steadily shifting weight from one foot to the other, as if unsure of the next step. Every movement, every hesitation spoke volumes. They treated me with the kind of polite distance that is used for someone considered incapable of making their own decisions. My mother had signed me out, but the hospital rules, the digital system, the staff's cautious compliance, all of it pressed down like an invisible weight, reminding me who they thought controlled the situation. As I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, I cataloged every detail. The medical charts stacked neatly by the bedside, the monitoring devices blinking rhythmically yet inconsistently, the nurse's hand twitching slightly when adjusting the IV drip. None of it escaped my notice. My pulse remained calm. Externally, I appeared passive. Internally, every observation, every anomaly was stored meticulously. The staff assumed I was compliant, quiet, and powerless, but in reality, each small detail added to a growing picture of the hospital's own missteps and overconfidence. They moved me through the hospital like a fragile object, carrying out procedures and checks as though I were a vessel of someone else's will. Every form required my mother's signature. Every update required approval from a doctor who appeared hesitant, almost reluctant. The digital records flashed with timestamps that didn't quite align, confirming the suspicion I had noted in the lobby. The electronic charts revealed slight discrepancies, a missing initial here, a double entry there, minute errors that would make perfect sense only to someone who knew what to look for. I did. The subtlety of control, the silent assertion of authority over my body and decisions, weighed heavily. My mother, confident and assured, seemed unaware of the careful network of oversight constraining me. Hospital rules, patient intake procedures, financial documentation, all systems were leveraged to enforce compliance, yet every micro flaw in their execution was a silent hint at my eventual leverage. I watched the orderly hesitating outside the room as the nurse explained something over the phone. There was fear there, barely perceptible, a tension I catalogued. Gaslighting began in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. "We just need to ensure your care is complete," the nurse said softly, adjusting the blanket over my lap. The words sounded harmless, almost polite, yet their intent was clear, to remind me subtly that the hospital system dictated the terms, not me. I nodded silently, my expression calm. Externally, I complied. Internally, I filed every inflection, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Even minor procedural anomalies were weaponized against me. When I requested clarification about the discharge process, the doctor explained rules that shifted slightly mid-sentence. I noted it, the inconsistency, the hesitation, the subtle implication that I could not act independently. My mother, observing from her chair nearby, smiled politely, unaware that each minor misalignment was another thread in a growing tapestry of leverage I was quietly gathering. As hours passed, I realized the extent of my isolation. Phone calls I tried to make were delayed or redirected, forms I asked to review were handed back incomplete, hospital staff consulted each other in whispers, careful to maintain control. Yet each interaction revealed their overconfidence, assumptions that I would remain passive, that I would not notice patterns, errors, or hesitation. I did. Every micro-expression, every procedural error, every shift of weight in the room told me that I was silently gathering the puzzle pieces for the eventual reversal. The subtle hum of authority extended beyond my immediate presence. Nurses' notes contained half-completed observations, timestamps didn't match the entries, and the doctor's electronic logs conflicted with printed reports. I cataloged it all, noting each potential discrepancy for future use. My mother, confident in her assumed control, remained unaware of the web of small errors she was entangled in. Each lapse was a quiet advantage, a hint that authority could be challenged and ultimately redirected, legally, ethically, and definitively. Even the smallest gestures were revealing. The orderly adjusted the bed frame twice before leaving the room, glancing at me once with attention I recognized as unspoken acknowledgement. The nurse's fingers trembled slightly over a keyboard, cursor hovering over my electronic records. Each blink, each twitch, each pause told a story they did not intend for me to read. And I read it, quietly, deliberately, my calm demeanor a shield that concealed my awareness and growing anticipation. I observed patterns, traced authority lines, and cataloged weaknesses in the system without ever raising my voice. This was slow-burn pressure, a silent endurance test designed to make me feel powerless. Yet the more they tried to assert control, the more I gathered mental evidence, timestamp mismatches, procedural gaps, minor errors in charting, conflicting instructions from staff. The hospital's system itself became a map of opportunity, each flaw a clue for a future correction. Even my mother's subtle expressions became data points. Her confident nods, the brief tightening of her jaw when she glanced at the digital records, the slight hesitation before giving instructions, all suggested overconfidence and an assumption that I was compliant. I stored it all. Each misstep she believed trivial, each authority figure's hesitation, was a marker for what would come. By the end of the day, the psychological pressure was undeniable. I felt it, the weight of systemic control and isolation, but I remained calm, poised, internally cataloging each opportunity, each minor mistake that would form the foundation of a legal and moral reversal. The quiet endurance of my position was itself a strategic move. By appearing passive, I allowed the hospital's own systems to reveal their vulnerabilities. In the shadows of authority, under the guise of compliance, I was quietly preparing. Observation, cataloging, awareness, these were my tools. Each micro-error, each hesitation, each inconsistency noted in detail, and every small procedural misstep was carefully recorded in memory. The imbalance of power was becoming increasingly clear, and I understood that patience, strategic awareness, and careful documentation would ultimately shift the authority in my favor. By the time evening descended, the silent pressure, the systemic control, and the understated gaslighting did not diminish my resolve. Each staff interaction, every micro-action, every procedural discrepancy strengthened my understanding of the environment. I knew precisely which doors would open when it was time, which moments would pivot in my favor, and which subtle authority gaps would allow the eventual legal and moral correction to unfold. I remained calm, observant, and unshakable. The hospital systems, the staff, the overconfident mother, all were unwittingly revealing the blueprint for the reversal that would come. My awareness was my power, my patience, my strength, and every small detail, every hesitation, every misalignment would become the foundation of a shift they could neither predict nor prevent. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, I felt the subtle shift in the air, as if the hospital itself exhaled in caution. Nothing had changed outwardly: the hum of monitors, the faint scent of antiseptic, the shuffling of distant staff, but every small gesture around me carried weight I had not noticed before. The nurse's hand lingered on the chart for a split second too long, her eyes flicking toward the scanner. The orderly paused mid-step, as if sensing that my awareness exceeded what they assumed. I did not move. I merely observed. I began to catalog everything: the timestamps on digital records, the slight misalignment of initials on forms, the sequence of orders logged into the system. Each anomaly was a breadcrumb. Some were minor, almost imperceptible: a form signed in the wrong section, a duplicate patient entry, a computer cursor hovering over a checkbox before completing the action. Others were more telling: notes from the attending physician contradicting entries from the nurse's log, subtle inconsistencies between electronic and physical paperwork. Every detail was recorded mentally, a silent ledger that no one suspected existed. The mother's presence loomed with quiet authority. She gave instructions to staff, as though the environment obeyed her command by default, yet she was oblivious to the micro-errors beneath her surface control. The electronic chart flickered with a discrepancy she would never notice: a signature line from yesterday's update that didn't match the intended procedure. I noted it silently. I did not confront. I did not react. Reacting would betray awareness. Silence was my strategy. I started to prepare tangible backups, copies of files that seemed routine to others but which, when cross-referenced, revealed missteps. A printout of admission forms, a series of electronic logs from the nurse's station, timestamps of medication administration, all quietly assembled. Conversations I recorded, legally, discreetly, highlighted inconsistencies in verbal instructions versus documented orders. Each small contradiction, each procedural lapse would serve as leverage when the time came. Subtle cues guided my next steps. The nurse adjusted a patient's chart in a way that contradicted a prior physician's note. I noticed how the cursor lingered over fields she had already filled, the small hesitations in her touch, the way her eyes darted toward the monitor for confirmation. These moments were not dramatic. They were quiet, almost mundane, yet in them I saw opportunity. Every microlapse was a puzzle piece. I kept track of patterns: who double-checked entries, who skipped steps, who left signatures incomplete. Staff movements, habitual phrasing, reaction times, all became data points. I cataloged these silently, assembling a mental blueprint of the hospital's operational gaps. No one acknowledged my presence as strategic. I remained a patient under observation, calm, compliant, unassuming, but every shift, every overlooked protocol was noted. At times, I caught the mother glancing at forms in a manner that suggested confidence, but I observed subtle signs of overextension: a slight tremor in her hand as she handed a document to the nurse, a pause in her voice when questioned by the attending physician, the micro-gestures of impatience masked as authority. Each subtle cue told a story of overconfidence and underpreparedness, traits that over time would unravel her control. I began to layer my preparation in steps: Copies were filed in a way that mirrored official documentation, but included annotations of discrepancies. Screenshots of electronic records were backed up, ensuring that the precise sequence of events was preserved. Every detail was verified against my mental ledger: date, time, signature, timestamp, procedural note. Even the smallest misalignment became evidence for a future procedural review. Interactions were observed with precision: the orderly's nod to the nurse when a misfiled form was corrected, the receptionist's hesitant pause while logging patient data. Each action noted, mentally timestamped, and filed. I did not engage. I did not reveal knowledge. To the untrained eye, I was passive, compliant, and focused on my own health. Internally, I was orchestrating a silent audit, every move calculated to highlight vulnerabilities in the system without raising suspicion. Micro-tensions emerged naturally: a delayed response from the nurse, a form temporarily missing from the electronic log, an attending physician slightly off script. These minor disruptions were not significant individually, yet when assembled, they painted a pattern of oversight, carelessness, and procedural gaps. I did not manipulate events. I observed them, quietly confirming that the foundation of authority surrounding me was not infallible. By mid-afternoon, I had compiled a discrete dossier: photographic copies of key forms, time-stamped digital logs, audio records of critical conversations, notes on procedural deviations. Each element was factual, neutral, and meticulously organized. I labeled and cross-referenced them, ensuring that when the time came to introduce these observations, they would be indisputable. Every file, every note, every record was a reflection of calm, methodical preparation. Throughout, I maintained composure. I never questioned authority aloud. I never raised my voice. I observed, cataloged, and silently assessed. Each small inconsistency became a part of a larger framework, a map of procedural vulnerability. This map was invisible to those around me, yet it would guide the course of future authority intervention. I anticipated micro-reactions from staff, noting who seemed flustered when minor irregularities were pointed out, who doubled down on routine to avoid scrutiny. I cataloged these subtle responses, mentally ranking confidence, attentiveness, and potential errors. I recorded all of this without confrontation, only observation, silent and complete. By evening, the room seemed ordinary. Monitors hummed, paperwork was stacked neatly, staff went about routines with practiced detachment. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet network of discrepancies had been documented, each layer prepared for eventual revelation. The balance of power had not shifted visibly, but I had built the foundation to guide it, layer by layer, observation by observation, minute by minute. Even as the hospital seemed indifferent, I had silently transformed from a passive observer to a strategist. Each microlapse, each hesitation, each procedural inconsistency was cataloged, noted, and preserved. Nothing escaped my attention: not a flicker of panic, not a misaligned signature, not a cursor hovering too long on a digital form. And as the night settled, I allowed myself a single thought: patience, quiet endurance, and meticulous preparation were more powerful than confrontation. By the time authority stepped in, I would be ready. I would not react, I would simply reveal. And the pattern I had documented, imperceptible to all, would speak louder than any outburst. The moment the compliance officer stepped into the room, the air seemed to thicken. The nurse, mid-step, froze with a clipboard clutched to her chest, her eyes darting to the computer terminal. My mother's pen trembled slightly over the discharge form she had insisted on signing just moments before, as if the weight of unseen scrutiny suddenly pressed down on her. I remained seated, calm, my hands folded, observing every minuscule reaction. The officer's gaze swept the room, methodical, almost clinical, and then paused at the papers in front of me. "May I see the patient files?" the officer asked, voice neutral but firm. The nurse hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she retrieved the folder with an awkward grace, as if aware that any misstep could unravel the controlled narrative my mother had tried to impose. My heart remained steady. I had meticulously copied, cataloged, and cross-referenced every document over the past days. Every timestamp, every signature, every note had been carefully noted, each small anomaly memorized. The doctor, who had been so confident in halting my discharge, now shifted slightly, clearing his throat. There was a subtle tightness in his jaw, a faint glance toward the officer, and for the first time, I sensed hesitation. My mother's voice, once commanding, faltered just a fraction as she said, "Everything should be in order." Her tone was precise, measured, yet the underlying tremor betrayed the panic she felt inside. The officer opened the first file, flipping through pages with deliberate speed, pausing only when a minor inconsistency caught their attention. A date mismatch, a signature slightly misaligned, a form number that didn't match the master log. Each anomaly was noted, each discrepancy quietly documented. The nurse exchanged a glance with my mother, an unspoken warning flickering between them. For the first time, they were aware that the control they thought they had was slipping. I sat silently, letting the scene unfold. My observations remained calm, calculated. Every subtle error, every misstep my mother and the staff had made in their confidence was now evidence. I had recorded conversations with hospital administration, verified procedural norms, and ensured that all documentation pointed to this simple truth. My discharge should never have been obstructed, and the override by my mother, though legally presented, contained procedural faults that gave the hospital the authority to pause and review. "Can you clarify why these signatures are mismatched?" the officer asked, looking directly at my mother. She hesitated, frowning, fingers tightening on the pen. The doctor, usually so commanding, opened his mouth, then closed it again, weighing his words. His hesitation spoke louder than any statement could. The nurse shuffled papers nervously, glancing at me briefly as if to gauge whether I was going to interject. I remained perfectly still, letting the authority do its work. The officer then turned to me. "Were these documents presented accurately when discharge was requested?" they asked. I nodded, my voice calm. "Yes, I have copies of every form, every conversation, and every timestamp." There was no emotion in my tone, just clear, factual reporting. I handed over the meticulously organized copies. Each sheet was in order, labeled, and ready for verification. The room had shifted. My mother's confidence wavered, the doctor's authority had dulled, and the nurse's composure trembled. They had all underestimated the quiet strength in my observation, the patience in preparation, and the lawfulness in my actions. The officer scanned the files, noting each irregularity with professional detachment. Every small detail I had collected over the past days now served as a mirror reflecting the arrogance and oversight of those who had tried to control me. Minutes felt like hours. The officer cross-referenced, asked brief questions, confirmed procedures, and highlighted deviations. My mother opened her mouth, then shut it again. The doctor cleared his throat, but had no words that could override the mounting procedural evidence. The nurse shifted uneasily, realizing that the system itself had been prepared for this confrontation, and that their attempt to bypass it had been observed, anticipated, and countered. "Given the discrepancies and procedural inconsistencies," the officer finally said, voice steady and neutral, "we will need to temporarily halt any discharge initiated outside the proper protocol until everything is verified." The statement was calm, professional, and final. My mother's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, her previous authority eroded by the systematic exposure of errors she hadn't anticipated. The doctor's confidence had evaporated, replaced with careful, hesitant compliance. The nurse's clipboard trembled slightly in her grasp. I remained seated, calm, controlled. Every minute of silent observation, every discreet record, and every careful preparation had led to this pivot. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatics, just undeniable procedural truth. The tension in the room was thick, but I did not flinch. I had allowed the authority to assert itself, and the power had shifted naturally, legally, and inevitably. As the officer concluded their review and left instructions for verification, my mother and the staff retreated into themselves, visibly recalculating. I exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement of the strategic patience and adherence to lawful observation that had brought this moment to fruition. The room was still, the power dynamic reversed subtly but undeniably, and I remained the calm center around which the storm had passed. Every glance, every gesture, and every subtle shift had been observed, catalogued, and noted. I had not interfered, I had not protested, and yet the truth, the law, and the careful preparation had spoken louder than any argument could. The authority recognized the procedural errors, my mother's overreach, and the hospital's obligation to adhere to protocol. And as I left the room, quietly, calmly, the subtle tension behind each face told me everything I needed to know. The reversal was real, the oversight had been caught, and the quiet patience of preparation had prevailed over arrogance, over control, and over false authority. The day had shifted, not with dramatics, not with outbursts, but with the inevitable, calculated, lawful exposure of truth. I walked forward, unshaken, steady, and fully aware that the foundation of power had quietly realigned, leaving me in a place of calm authority, observation, and undeniable strength. The compliance officer's gaze lingered on the documents I had silently prepared, each copy precise, each timestamp verified. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Staff and mother alike hovered at the edge of unease, their confidence slowly eroding. I remained calm, my hands folded over the stack of evidence, my pulse steady, my mind tracing every detail, knowing the moment I had been waiting for had arrived. The officer spoke in measured tones, laying out the inconsistencies I had meticulously observed over the past days. Misaligned signatures, form versions that didn't match the hospital system, subtle discrepancies in the electronic records, and overlooked procedural steps. Each point was deliberate, factual, devoid of emotion, yet it carried an undeniable weight. I noticed Mother's hand tremble ever so slightly as she tried to interject explanations, but her voice faltered under scrutiny. Staff members exchanged quiet, anxious glances, the realization of their oversight dawning too late. I calmly provided clarifications where requested, handing over additional documentation without a single word of accusation or gloating. The officer took each piece with a professional nod, noting details carefully. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, only the undeniable authority of truth and proper procedure. Every micro-error, every procedural lapse that had seemed inconsequential before was now being acknowledged, turning the tide of power entirely in my favor. As the review progressed, the room's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The once tense, controlled environment maintained by Mother's insistence and staff's quiet compliance was now replaced with a subtle unease. I watched this shift with a detached clarity, understanding that patience and preparation had achieved what confrontation alone never could. Each document, each time-stamped record, each careful observation became a brick in the foundation of my quiet victory. Finally, the officer summarized the findings. Rights were confirmed, errors acknowledged, and authority reasserted according to proper protocol. Mother's overreach and the staff's procedural lapses were highlighted, but not in a humiliating way, simply as factual realities that demanded acknowledgement. The room felt lighter, though the weight of prior injustice lingered, tempered now by the satisfaction of an earned resolution. I kept my composure, my voice soft and even, expressing only gratitude for the professionalism and diligence of the authority present. As the officer concluded, Mother retreated into quiet reflection, her earlier assertiveness replaced with reluctant acceptance. Staff members exchanged quiet, anxious glances, the realization of their oversight dawning too late. I observed it all calmly, noting that the arrogance which had once seemed unshakable had crumbled under the weight of methodical preparation. Alone in the moment after the official review concluded, I allowed myself a brief inward breath of relief, not for revenge, not for victory in the conventional sense, but for the affirmation of quiet endurance and measured action. My strength had come not from anger, confrontation, or dramatics, but from patience, careful observation, and an unwavering commitment to the law and proper process. I reflected briefly on boundaries, dignity, and the value of silence. There was power in restraint, in allowing truth to speak for itself. Every step I had taken, meticulously documented conversations, carefully saved forms, subtle notes of procedural inconsistencies, had culminated in this inevitable acknowledgement. The lesson was clear. Knowledge, patience, and adherence to proper authority were far more effective than any impulsive reaction could ever be. With the review complete and the hospital staff now adhering to proper protocol, I walked calmly out of the room, my posture composed, my mind clear. There was no celebration, no display of triumph, only a quiet satisfaction, an internal recognition that justice had been served in the most professional, undeniable, and controlled manner possible. As I stepped into the corridor, the sunlight spilling across the floor felt warmer than ever. The ordeal, though draining, had affirmed my belief in the power of preparation, patience, and strategic restraint. I had moved from a position of perceived weakness to undeniable strength, all without raising my voice or compromising my dignity. The hospital, once a place where authority had been wielded against me, now reflected the proper order I had helped restore. Mother's overreach, staff negligence, and procedural lapses had been addressed, not through conflict or confrontation, but through calm, factual, and unwavering adherence to the principles of justice and protocol. I paused for a moment at the exit, letting the experience settle within me. There was no need for words, no desire for acknowledgement beyond what the law and process had already provided. The strength I carried was quiet but absolute. And as I walked past the threshold, leaving the room and the tension behind, I knew this ending was not just a conclusion, but a statement. A statement of patience, of preparation, of dignity preserved, and of justice served in the most controlled, ethical, and undeniable way possible. No gloating, no threats, only quiet, permanent resolution.